Drew here with Musician on a Mission, and today you're going to learn how to make your MIDI strings sound a lot more realistic. We're going to start out with the absolute basics, and we're going to build up to some more advanced techniques that you can use to get really great sounding strings just using MIDI. So let's get started. Now, the first thing you're going to do before you even write anything is think about the size of the orchestra. Smaller groups like soloists and quartets can play a lot busier, more intricate parts. It's just a few players, so they can have a lot more going on without it sounding messy. Large symphonies can become just a huge wall of sound if there's too much going on. So with larger groups, you're usually going to have something a bit more droning. So just think about that and decide which one will fit better in your song. Let's check out the song I've got in front of me right now, and we'll think about what size of group we want to have for the strings. So let's check it out.
Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running? Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running?
So yeah, as you can hear, this is the bridge of an indie rock song, and there's already quite a bit going on. You know, with a lot of modern songs, there's plenty of other instrumentation, so it probably wouldn't sound very good to have a ton of strings going on. So I think it's best for us to stick to a small section of strings, and we're actually just gonna have them doing some supporting chords, maybe some counter melodies, rather than something really intricate, because for this song, that's just not gonna work. So once you've figured out what the size of your string section should be and how intricate their parts are going to be, you need to think about orchestration. These are basically the rules of writing for strings, and you have to understand the basics to get something that would sound like a real string part. There are a few things to talk about here. So let's take a look at the articulations. I'm just using Logic's stock string sounds. This is the stock violin, and let's take a look through the articulations. First up, you've got legato, often called sustain. This is just long and sweeping notes. When you think about strings, you're probably usually thinking about legato. You've also got staccato, which is just quickly dragging the bow across the string real quick. Spiccato is the same thing, except you actually lift the bow off the string. It's got a little bit of, depending on how hard you play, it could sound lighter or a lot hastier than the regular staccato. You've also got pizzicato, which is just plucking. And finally, there's tremolo, which is pulling the bow back and forth really quickly. Obviously, there are a ton of other articulations here, and they're all worth checking out and looking into, but these are the fundamental ones that you're gonna see all the time in songs. When you start writing for strings, think about how you can use these different articulations to your advantage, and switching between them can help you get a much more dynamic sound, something that sounds a lot more similar to what a real string player would do. The next thing in orchestration you want to think about is the role that all of these different instruments play inside of a song usually. Cello and bass usually establish the root of the chord and the basic rhythm. Basses are really good at filling out the low end, but they usually don't move around too much. Here, let me show you what I mean. I'll pull one up right now. And as you can hear, that's really low, so you can't move across those strings particularly fast unless you're plucking. Next up, you got cellos, which are a little bit higher. And cellos often reinforce the bass, but they're capable of a lot more movement. You've got the violas, and violas and second violins kind of fulfill similar roles. They tend to play stuff that's in between the ranges of the higher violins and the cellos, and usually they're doing either held out notes that are harmonies, or they're doing counter melodies that'll reinforce the cellos or reinforce the first violins. Speaking of which, the first violins usually play our melody. They're the highest part of the song usually. So yeah, as you're writing for your song, try to fit all of those instruments naturally in the range that they would play and have them doing stuff that they would normally be doing. You know, the basses should probably be either plucking if they are moving a lot, or they should just be holding slow notes. The cellos should be supporting the basses or providing a counter melody. Same thing for the second violin and violas, probably playing a support role, while the first violins are doing a lot more movement and are providing the melody up in the higher register. A great thing you can do to make sure that you do this right is just read up on what the different ranges are for these instruments. That way you know you're playing in the right range for them. So now that we've brushed up on the orchestration a little bit, let's think about what this song needs. Like I said, it's got quite a bit going on already when we listen to it.
Can't you see that I'm burning?
You know, we've already got guitars, bass, 2 vocalists, and drums. That's quite a bit going on, so we don't need something super busy, I don't think. And we actually don't need basses either, since there's already a bass part. So I'm just gonna cut out the bass entirely from the string section and just focus on doing some kind of backgroundy stuff to provide counter melodies. So I'm just gonna throw something in for the first violins that I think sounds pretty good. Let's try it out.
Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running?
All right, cool. So we've got our violin counter melody there, and there's definitely room for improvement, but we've already done one of the most important things, which is record it in with a MIDI keyboard. So you really want to use a MIDI keyboard if you have one to record in your string parts, because one of the biggest giveaways of MIDI strings is MIDI velocity. You know, if you're writing in the MIDI notes by hand or using musical typing, the velocities of all the MIDI notes are going to be exactly the same, which will be a dead giveaway that it's fake. So use a MIDI keyboard if you can. That's gonna do a whole lot to make this sound way better. Before we get into our next tip, I'm just gonna record in a few more parts that we can play around with and enhance the sound. All right, so I went in and made some changes. I added some supporting parts with the violin, viola, and cello, and I ended up deciding that that first violin part I had originally recorded was just way too busy. You know, it wasn't serving the song. It was a cool melody, but it was not what the song needed. So remember that it's okay to get rid of stuff that isn't serving the song. Whatever you do with the strings, it needs to be something that the song needs. And that one melody, even though I liked it, it just wasn't what the song needed. So now we've got something else. I've recorded this all in with a MIDI keyboard, so we've got some velocity differentiation going on already, and let's check out how it sounds.
Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running? Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running?
So yeah, something a lot more atmospheric that can just like sit behind the vocals a little bit more. Right now they're pretty front and center, that way you can hear them, but obviously in a mix I'd push these back behind the vocals more. So let's move on. The next thing that we're gonna wanna do is automate. Automation is absolutely essential when working with MIDI strings. Basically, you need to automate the volume and the dynamics of your strings, especially if they're holding out long legato notes like both of these violin parts are doing right now. It's a nice harmony, but you can tell right away once you hear it that those aren't real strings. That's not a real violinist playing these parts. And the quickest giveaway is the fact that the volume is staying pretty much the same throughout each note. You know, even though the different notes have different velocities, over the course of each note that's played, it doesn't fade in and then kind of ebb out the way a string part would normally do. So we need to automate that. And the best way to do this is with a MIDI controller once again. So if you've got a MIDI keyboard or some kind of other controller that has faders that you can assign to the automation, I really recommend that you do that, because you're gonna have a way easier time. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I'm gonna pull open Smart Controls and learn a parameter. Let's set this volume. There we go. So I've just moved, I've selected this in the Smart Control, the volume knob, and then I moved the volume knob on my MIDI keyboard, and now it's assigned to that as well. So let's go ahead and re-record over this, and I'm gonna move that volume knob with the track so that we're writing that automation. And of course, if we want to do that, we're gonna have to set this to touch. That way, as I play the song, it knows that I want it to write automation instead of just read it.
Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running? Can't you see?
Sweet. So it's a subtle difference, but once I do this with the other violin, you're really gonna hear how much better this is. So let me do that once again. I'm gonna map the parameters just like I did before, and then I'll play along to the song and just rewrite this volume automation so that it's a little bit more natural. All right, sweet. So let's hear both of those together and see how they sound now.
Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay?
You hear how it ebbs and flows better than it did before. It's not perfect right now. You know, if this was a real song I was working on, I'd spend a little bit more time getting that automation right, because, you know, right now it kind of cuts in and out a little bit too quickly. It's a little unnatural, but if I spent a little bit more time tweaking this and making sure that I got the performance of that automation right, it would sound absolutely incredible. And I really recommend that you do the same for your tracks when you're using MIDI strings. And I'd even do the same thing for these staccato viola and pizzicato cello, because I want to make sure that everything is ebbing and flowing. A string player wouldn't just play things at the same volume over the course of the entire part. Make sure that there's some real dynamic change to it over time. So you need to be adding that in with automation to your MIDI strings as well if you want them to sound like real strings. The last tip I want to talk about today is mixing and editing your MIDI strings. When you're editing these, you're going to want to use very little, maybe even no quantizing. I'm not going to quantize these string parts whatsoever. I don't want them to be on the grid because real string players wouldn't be perfectly to the grid. There is some humanization that's just written right into a human playing a string part. You know, they're slightly off time from one another. So you don't want all of your strings to be perfectly in time with one another. In fact, I might intentionally go in here and make sure that the viola and cello are slightly different, because I just copied the viola part down and pitched it down an octave. So right now is probably a little too similar to one another, and I would need to add some more imperfection rather than make them more perfect. As for EQ, I'd probably EQ these the same way I would pretty much any other instrument, which is to say I'd cut out any ranges I don't need. You know, this is a violin, so I'd probably want more of this upper range stuff than the lower. And I'd do the same for all these other ones. Like I'd probably turn up some of the lower things in the cello and turn down some of these highs. And of course, I'd want to do pocket EQing with the rest of my track. That way I make sure these strings aren't covering up anything else. But yeah, EQ, I'd mostly just do cleaning EQ and stuff that'll help these strings shine rather than really tonal stuff. Next up, as far as compression goes, strings usually aren't compressed a ton. You might compress them a little bit more for a pop track, but generally speaking, you're not doing a ton of stuff. The most I would normally do is a bus compressor. So I'd go in here and I'd grab a bus compressor and I'd throw it on the bus for all of the strings. That way I'm just compressing them together and kind of gluing them. That way they sound like they're all together as a section. So, you know, I wouldn't be shooting for a ton of gain reduction here. I'd just be doing some really subtle stuff with a pretty fast attack and a medium to long release. So let's see.
Can't you see that I'm
Yeah, that's probably too much gain reduction right there. So let me turn that ratio down.
Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running? Can't you see that I'm burning? Will you stay? Are you running?
So yeah, I'd really probably just compress the strings together here, maybe a little bit of compression on this violin, but nothing too wild there because strings are meant to be dynamic most of the time. Lastly, I'd turn down any reverb that was on the plugin automatically. I don't know that I have any on here right now, but if I had some reverb, I'd turn that down, probably not all the way because strings aren't, you know, totally dry. They're usually recorded in pretty live spaces, so I'd leave a little bit on there, but then I'd send them to my room reverb, any of the reverbs that the rest of my instruments would be going to. This is just a volume balance mix here, pretty much just doing some EQ and volume fader changing, so this isn't a full mix with reverb. I'm not going to do that right now, but once I got to that stage of the mix where I was adding reverb, I would want to send these strings there as well. Finally, one last thing thing I want to talk to you about today is upgrading your strings. You know, should you get some premium string samples to use as opposed to the stock sounds in your DAW? I think that really depends on how much you're going to be using strings. You know, if you just have a song every now and then that you're going to use strings on, it might not be worth the investment. But if you're using strings all the time, you've got really orchestral soundtracks you're making or anything like that, then it probably is worth looking into upgrading at some point. So just think about that. In the meantime, I say just use your stock plugins and check out Spitfire Labs. I'm not paid by them to advertise this or anything like that. I just think it's a good plugin. Basically, Spitfire Labs is a free thing that Spitfire Strings puts out, and they've just got all kinds of great string samples that they put out there for free, like this one. So yeah, it's a really lush sounding thing, and they've got a few other ones. So if you want to experiment with different string sounds and you're not ready to make the plunge to an expensive one, and I recommend that you really think about it before you buy an expensive string plugin, check this out, because Labs is really great. You can do incredible stuff with it. You don't necessarily need to spend any money on strings whatsoever. So yeah, just to review real quick, to make your MIDI strings sound realistic, you want to think about the size of the string section you need and how busy the part's gonna be. If it's a really intricate song already, like the one I've got here, you probably want a small section that isn't doing a ton. Next, you want to understand orchestration, and that really just means knowing what the different kinds of articulations that strings will play are, just understanding what roles these instruments usually play inside of a song. Finally, you want to use a MIDI keyboard and automate the dynamics of your track. Mix and edit your strings as if they're real strings, you know, have some reverb on them, but maybe make sure you're sending it to the real room reverb as well. Not a ton of quantization, not a lot of compression or EQ. And really, that's it. It's really that simple. Once you mix it in with the rest of the track, these are gonna sound pretty good, especially if you've spent time getting that automation down, making sure the automation sounds really good. But getting your MIDI strings to sound real is just one part of making great music from home. If you really wanna make sure you get the most out of every song, make sure you check out this free workshop from Rob Mazes at Musician on a Mission. He goes over the 7 steps to getting radio-ready mixes, and he shows you his approach to home recordings and mixing, which is gonna help you do all of this way faster. 36,000 people have already done this workshop. It's really only taken them a few days to start seeing results, so check it out if you wanna avoid wasting your time and your money on the wrong things. And if you're new here and you like the video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. All right, that's all from me. I'm Drew with Musician on a Mission. I'll see you again soon, and remember, create regardless.